Welcome, everyone. Happy Women's History Month and happy International Women's Day. I'm Courtney Casper, Visitor Experience Manager at the Equal Rights Heritage Center in Auburn, New York. And thank you so much for joining us for tonight's virtual evening with Dorothy Wickenden, here to discuss her new book, The Agitators, Three Friends Who Fought for Abolition and Women's Rights. The book debuts March 30th and is available for pre-order at a retailer of your choosing. And we are so honored that Ms. Wickenden is here for her very first book event with us tonight. We also have some special guests that will be joining us this evening that you will get to meet a little bit later as we dive into Auburn's three agitators, Harriet Tubman, Martha Coffin Wright, and Frances A. Seward. And if anyone tuning in has questions for Dorothy or any of our panelists, please just post them in the Facebook Live comment section. This program tonight is part of the third annual Shining a Light on Harriet Tubman, an event that's sponsored by the City of Auburn's Historic and Cultural Sites Commission. And now to welcome our special guest. Dorothy Wickenden is the author of Nothing Daunted and The Agitators, and has been the executive editor of The New Yorker since January 1996. She is also the writer for the magazine and is the moderator of its weekly podcast, Politics and More. A former Nieman Fellow at Harvard, Wickenden was National Affairs Editor at Newsweek from 1993 to 1995. And before that was the longtime executive editor at the New Republic. She lives with her husband in Westchester, New York. And Dorothy also has a special tie to the city of Auburn, as her grandmother, Dorothy Woodruff, who you can read about in Nothing Daunted, was from Auburn. And she passed on a piece of family lore that part inspired the agitators. So we look forward to learning more about this. So welcome, Dorothy. We're happy to have you here this evening.
Thank you so much, Courtney. It is great to be back in Auburn, virtually anyway, and I hope we'll all be together again sometime very soon. And I did think I'd start by telling a family story about my grandmother, Dorothy Woodruff, and her closest friend, Rosamond Underwood, even though I was scooped today by the Auburn Citizen. But for those of you who don't get the Citizen, Dorothy and Roz were born in Auburn in 1887. And when they were little girls, maybe 4 or 5, they were on South Street one day, relatively near the Seward house, probably outside Roz's parents' house. And I was told that as they stood there, an elderly woman rode by on her bicycle, Auburn's most famous resident, Harriet Tubman. Judy Bryant, who's well-versed in her family history and is here tonight on our panel, pointed out that she's a descendant of Harriet Tubman, she pointed out when I told her this story that it was much more likely a horse and cart. But I still continue to be floored by the idea that my grandmother's life somehow intersected with Harriet Tubman's, even just briefly. It wasn't 6 degrees of separation. It was more like, 4 or 5 or 3. And that led to a question that kept nagging me, even as I was just working on my previous book. How did Harriet Tubman, who was enslaved on the Eastern Shore for 27 years, end up spending almost half a century in Auburn? The agitators began with that question, and it took me about 7 years to fully answer it. I decided that I had to find out more about 2 other Auburn women who were associates of hers. Martha Coffin Wright, a middle-class Quaker with 6 children, and Frances Seward, the aristocratic wife of the controversial anti-slavery statesman William H. Seward. Abolitionists, of course, didn't work in isolation. They needed trusted associates across the North. Tubman, Wright, and Frances Seward, brought together by a mutual contact, began covertly working together in the 1850s to help overturn slavery and to demand equal rights for women. And then for the rest of their lives, they were devoted friends. Frances suffered from migraine headaches and depression, and she chose to live quietly in Auburn rather than with Seward, who loved throwing elaborate parties for the political elite in Washington. Frances had no interest in that. She hated Washington, where slavery was legal. But she was this closet radical. I knew from my grandmother, actually, that in the decades before the Civil War, some people in Auburn opened their houses and barns as station stops on the Underground Railroad. Two of these stops, I discovered as I began this journey, were run by Martha and Frances, who hid freedom seekers in their basement kitchens. One rare occasion when Seward was home and Frances was away, he wrote to her, "The Underground Railroad works wonderfully. Two passengers came here last night." Martha was a born rebel, though you might not have known that at first. Her husband ran a local law firm, and she really envied him his stimulating work as she saw it and his freedom to travel. She had 6 children, and her daily chores generally consumed her from daybreak until really late at night. Just bathing the youngest children, she wrote in one of her letters, took her 3 hours one day, with the hauling of the water from the well and so on. Her only real outlet was her steady correspondence with her oldest sister, Lucretia Mott, the famous Quaker minister and early advocate for universal human rights. In one letter, Martha glumly summed up the drudgery of her days. She wrote, "The only way is to grub and work and sweep and dust and wash and dress children and make gingerbread and patch and darn." But more often she was sardonic, really witty about her frustrations. She liked puns, I discovered, and in another letter, she wrote about beating eggs with a quill, as another housewife had recommended. She made a hideous mess with the feathers all drooping and coated with the yolk, and concluded that the idea must have been invented by a goose. My nice wire egg beater is good enough for me. Frances and Martha lived right around the corner from each other, and they got together all the time to gossip and talk about their husbands and their children, and to talk about politics, which were radically changing at the time. Frances herself had become radicalized about women's rights in the late 1820s when she discovered that her brother in law was beating her dear sister Lizette, who lived around the corner as well. Frances wrote to Seward, and she was just a very young wife at the time, both of those women were, describing Lizette's husband as the brute she lives with. Lizette couldn't leave the marriage. By law, she was her husband's property. Men had total control over their wives, including the right to batter them. Women couldn't sit on juries, make a will, sign a contract, or file a lawsuit. And of course, they couldn't vote. And if a woman dared to pursue divorce, she lost everything, her children, any money she had inherited, and of course, her reputation. Frances told Seward in her letter, "Men have framed laws, I believe, to uphold themselves in their wickedness." And that was 1829. That was really early to be talking about divorce, even privately. In 1835, during a summer trip to the South, Frances got her first view of slavery, which she wrote about in her journal. One day in Virginia, at a tavern north of Richmond, the Sewards heard the sounds of weeping and moaning and saw 10 naked boys tied together by their wrists and fastened to a long rope. They watched with horror as a tall white man led them to a horse trough to drink, and then to a shed where they lay down, sobbing themselves to sleep. The slave trader was taking them to Richmond, where they would be sold at auction, just a few of the tens of thousands of people Virginia supplied to the cotton and rice fields of the Deep South every year. This was incredible material and almost entirely overlooked by William Seward's biographers. In the first comprehensive account of his life, published in 1967, Glyndon Van Dusen blithely dismissed Frances as a neurotic invalid, and subsequent biographers gave her only glancing treatment. So early on, I contacted the Rush Rhys Library at the University of Rochester, which contains the Seward archives, just to see what remained of Frances's papers. And I found out that with a few small gaps, they were all there. 4 decades of correspondence, and much of it with Seward himself. The curator told me that in 1952, when the Seward's grandson donated the collection, the boxes of Frances's papers were set aside as worthless. That was just as infuriating to me as Van Dusen's remark, but it was also a little bit like stumbling across buried treasure. As I began reading the letters, they felt eerily alive 2 centuries later. Well, as I discovered in Nothing Daunted, personal correspondence can open a window onto epic historical events. Martha's letters at the Sophia Smith collection at Smith College showed how in the 1840s she and Frances began talking more seriously about what they could do to foment change. Martha and Frances had kind of an informal lending library. Frances had a terrific library, and Martha often borrowed books from her. One of them, which she read in 1841, was a printed lecture by a judge who argued that women were entitled to the full enjoyment of unalienable rights, an outrageous idea at the time. Of course, Martha and Frances embraced it. In July 1848, Martha joined Lucretia Mott and 3 other women to organize the first meeting devoted to women's rights, the Seneca Falls Convention, not far from Auburn. Over those 2 days, Martha befriended 2 people who changed her life: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was the driving force of the convention, and Frederick Douglass, the world famous abolitionist who had just started his newspaper, the North Star, in Rochester. Stanton enlisted Martha in the incipient women's rights movement, and Douglass drew her further into abolition. He regularly gave talks across New York State, and Martha invited him to the house whenever he was in the area. After one of Douglass's visits, Martha attended a bridal party in Auburn, where she wrote she was asked, with the slightest possible sneer about our recent guests. The woman wished to be informed whether we gave them the best room. She replied, certainly. At another party, Martha overheard 2 guests gossiping. One asked, who is that fine-looking lady? The other replied, that is Mrs. David Wright. She is a very dangerous woman. By the time Martha and Frances met Harriet Tubman in the early 1850s, they too were insurgents, ready to help her in any way possible. So this was a history that had never been told. 3 women who had no power at all to conspiring to bring on the Second American Revolution. I wanted to show how they transformed themselves from really abject dependence into dissidents determined to demand the dignity and rights of every American. Harriet Tubman saw Martha and Frances as 2 of her most trusted allies, and they really drew great strength and inspiration from her. And even throughout the course of these 7 years I was working on the book, it just kept occurring to me how much lasting resonance this story has. So most recently, just look at the advent of Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and this most recent renewed determination in Southern states to suppress the Black vote, with perhaps a more powerful revolt building against that effort. A friend recently sent me a photo she took in New York City. It shows one of those army green postal collection boxes covered with graffiti, including 4 images of Tubman, and they're labeled Harriet Tubman, total badass. She, of course, never had the opportunity to learn to read and write, so there were no letters to draw on. In that case, there was excellent scholarship about her, but I really wanted to portray her as a fully fledged character with weaknesses and quirks, as well as her legendary strengths. She was a riveting storyteller and public speaker, and her friends and audiences across New York and in Boston wrote down what she said. And I think this was her way of creating an indelible oral history. And I thought I'd just tell one of her favorite stories. It's about her starring role in the spectacular rescue of a young man named Charles Now in Troy, New York. Now was arrested on April 27, 1860, under the Fugitive Slave Act. That had been passed a decade earlier, and it was the law that allowed slaveholders to enter free states, find people they believe had escaped from slavery, get them arrested, and return them to the South, to slavery. The law had radicalized the entire North, and nowhere, I might add, more than upstate New York. So Harriet was passing through Troy, visiting a cousin. Now was working there as a coachman, saving money so that he could eventually buy freedom for his children. He was arrested outside a bakery and taken to the office of the federal commissioner, who would hold a pro forma hearing. Harriet rushed to the scene and, using a ruse that served her well in some of her Maryland rescue operations, impersonated a stooped old woman, her face obscured by a sunbonnet. She pushed through the crowds that gathered and made her way into the building where Now was being held, and headed up the stairs to ascertain when he'd be escorted down. As officers took him into the street, Harriet leaped up, pushed past them, and grabbed Nal, fending off the constable's blows while she guided him through the crowd, which was now thousands of people. Local reporters were on the scene, and one participant in the rescue later said it seemed a miracle that she appeared just at that time. So that whole account was written in newspaper accounts at the time. Nal's head was battered, and his wrists were cut and bloody from the handcuffs. Harriet's coat was torn off, and her shoes were ripped from her feet. Supporters in the crowd propelled them down Congress Street toward the dock, where a skiff was waiting for Nal. He was rowed across the Hudson to the town of West Troy, followed by Tubman. You know, you'd expect this kind of courage and quick thinking from her, but she also had a wonderful sense of humor. When she really was a stooped old woman, she held the children of Auburn spellbound, telling them that as she pulled Nal away from the policeman, one of them clubbed her, but she said, I knocked him squawking. Then she attacked the marshal's deputy, she said, and offered a graphic demonstration about how she choked him till his tongue stuck out like that. Nal was hit so hard he lost consciousness. The children who were listening were momentarily worried, then shouted with relieved laughter as she told them that she threw him across her shoulder like a bag of meal and took him away out of there. So I thought with that, let's talk about these three badass women.
Yes, thank you, Dorothy. And I think it's really interesting that it shows us that we're not that far removed from our history. And I think it's really important that these three women were so very different, but they are the epitome in the past and still today of what that importance is to be an ally and what that means. And so really looking forward to diving into this conversation with our panel. And I'd like to introduce now our moderator for the evening, Dr. Rhoda Overstreet Wilson. Dr. Rhoda Overstreet Wilson was born and raised in Auburn, New York. She's the executive director of a well-known and loved residence for the elderly, the Westminster Manor Adult Home. She's married to Roy Wilson, and they have 2 adult children. Dr. Overstreet Wilson received her doctorate in education from St. John Fisher College after successfully defending her dissertation on gender microaggression in July 2020. She is currently completing the New York State requirement to become a certified nursing home administrator. And she is currently the board president of the Booker T. Washington Community Center, the vice president of the Auburn Cayuga branch of the NAACP, and an Auburn Enlarged City School District board member. And prior to working with the elderly, she worked for over 20 years in the juvenile justice system. Dr. Overstreet Wilson sees it as a blessing to be able to pursue this work in the city that Harriet Tubman called home.
Well, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Courtney, for this opportunity to be a part of tonight. I genuinely appreciate that, and the opportunity to moderate this panel of enthusiasts of history and talk about their contributions, but also interact with Dorothy and this wonderful book that she's written. I had the opportunity to read that short excerpt that had been released, and I can't wait to buy the book to read the rest of it. So on tonight, joining us this evening as panel guests are Judith Bryant. Judith Bryant is the great-great-grandniece of Harriet Tubman, descendant from her brother Henry Ross, whose name was changed to William Henry Stewart in 1854. Ms. Bryant is a graduate of Syracuse University and worked for 12 years at IBM in New York, San Francisco, Hong Kong, and Westchester County. Prior to that, she worked as a secretary for 2 New York City law firms, one which included Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison, with Pauli Murray and the great-grandson of William Lloyd Garrison. After leaving IBM in 1976, she became an arts administrator in the North Country, where she worked with the Mohawk basket makers of Akwesasne, compiling an award-winning photographic exhibition and catalog of their work. Ms. Bryant also serves on the board of directors for the Skinny Atlas Festival. We also have the pleasure of having Michelle Jones Galvin. Michelle Jones Galvin and her mother, Joyce Stokes Jones, co-authored a creative nonfiction based on genealogical research and their family ties to Harriet Ross Tubman. Told from the perspective of descendants, Beyond the Underground, Aunt Harriet, Moses of Her People, 2013, portrays the life, times, and accomplishments of the famed abolitionist and speaks to the pivotal role of race, color, and discrimination in the lives of Tubman and her great-great-grandniece. Prior to retirement, Ms. Jones Galvin was the co-founder and former director of the Access Center and was the Special Projects Director and Director of Community Initiatives. She holds a master's degree in psychological research from the New School for Social Research and a bachelor's degree in sociology and African American studies from Fordham University. Ms. Joan Galvin serves on the board of directors for Focus Greater Syracuse, George and Rebecca Barnes Foundation, and the League of Women Voters. In 2019, she was awarded the Junior League of Syracuse 20th Annual Spirit of Mary Harriman Award for Community Leadership. And in 2020, the Syracuse Onondaga NAACP awarded Ms. Jones Galvin with a presidential award. We also have Kim Seswick, but we also know her as Ranger Kim. New Hampshire native, Ranger Kim is the Senior Interpretive Specialist at the Harriet Tubman National Historical Park in Auburn, New York. In March 2019, she was hired as the first full-time park ranger for the Harriet Tubman Park. A 17-year veteran of the National Park Service, Ranger Kim began her career as a seasonal park ranger at Lowell National Historical Park in Massachusetts, before joining the Northeast Region Lands Concession and Leasing Division as Realty Assistant. Ms. Sedgwick was the business management specialist before moving back to her original interest as park ranger in interpretation. She formerly served as the chief of interpretation at Fort Stanwix National Monument in Rome and chief of interpretation in Education Women's Rights National Historical Park in Seneca Falls. And we have the pleasure of also having Jeff Ludwig. Jeff Ludwig has been the Director of Education at the Seward House Museum since 2015. A part of his job is helping shape the museum's interpretation as he works to include the stories of Frances Seward, Harriet Tubman, and more prominently in the guided tour narratives, as well as in the new exhibitions. Mr. Ludwig received his PhD in American History from the University of Rochester and previously taught at SUNY Geneseo. So this evening, we will kick this panel off tonight with Jeff. Let's start with you.
Thank you so much, Rhoda, and thanks to everyone here joining me tonight. I'm delighted and honored to be a part of this panel. It's a pleasure to get to see Dorothy face-to-face for the first time. I feel like I know her from having spent the last year or two reading manuscripts and advanced copies of a wonderful book. I hope everyone, not quite as lucky as me, I know my background might make it hard to get, has put this in their shopping cart or their library list, wherever your local booksellers are, place your order. I know you're going to want to read that. If you've not read the excerpt already that's been mentioned from the New Yorker, please do. I feel like every paragraph or two from that was basically a chapter from this book. So if you enjoyed that, you'll really be able to unpack it in wonderful detail. It's incredibly well written. And we hope to be able to welcome Dorothy to Auburn in person this fall. We're hoping for September for a book talk and book signing. So get your copy now and get your signature soon. I was asked to be able to kick off tonight. I had a whole legal pad full of questions. And I realize we're already about halfway through this, so it's probably not appropriate to just start peppering lots of questions, but in trying to come up with some big points that we might, as a panel, discuss, it occurred to me that what the Agitators does really well, showing the linkages between these women, uniting them, but also letting each of their stories grow independently. They're entwined, you can separate them. Some big themes that I think you will read in this book and we can talk about tonight are these. One is recoveries. As Dorothy's already talked about, while we think and we celebrate these three women, they've all been overshadowed in some sense, really for the last 100 to 150 years for one reason or another, whether it was because archivists thought their papers were worthless or what. For Frances Seward, overshadowed in large part by her husband and by archivists who relegated her. For Martha Coffin Wright, I think overshadowed perhaps by her sister, Lucretia Mott, who tends to get more of the focus and the attention, or some of the other bigger names who went to Seneca Falls. For Harriet Tubman, it seems preposterous to stand here and to say she's been overshadowed. That's true recently, much less so now, thankfully, but she still tends to be overshadowed by her own mythology, and unpacking what is real and true, which is important, from some of the legend that has surrounded Harriet Tubman is work worth doing, which we can do every year during this week in this book and talk about tonight. Another big theme, I think, is resonances and legacies. What do these stories have to teach us today? A lot. I hope we can get into that. And really, I think what the genius of this book is giving us these agitators, these badass women, together and apart. I know all of us here have our own expertise in parts of these stories. What Dorothy has done is really show us how they converge and intersect together. I would love to kick off by asking anyone who wants to join in, what do they know from their backgrounds in Harriet Tubman, William Seward, Martha Coffin Wright, about that person's relationship with the others? Because for me, I don't think the sources for any three of these women are elusive. They were often overlooked. You can go to the archives and read Frances's letters or Martha's letters. The legacy of Harriet Tubman is so big, you have to spend years just unpacking it. But how do we find them together? I think that's the real challenge, is looking for primary sources where we can see all three of them coming together. Dorothy has done that for us brilliantly, and it's a gift. But I would love to know about her own research. How hard was her to see these patterns? When did she first see these patterns? And for everyone else, what do you know about the person or the people who isn't your person? Thank you.
Okay.
So I think that was a question for Dorothy. How did you first see the patterns when you were doing your research between these three women?
I'll try to keep it short because I really want to hear from Judy and Michelle and everyone else. I actually first began to see them at the Seward House Museum because I had gone there to do some research for my previous book, Nothing Daunted, because my grandmother had told me that her grandparents lived next door to the Sewards. So I just wanted quickly to go in, answer that question, and finish my research on that book. And Jeff's predecessor, Jennifer Haynes, wouldn't let me go. She kept talking. She took me on a private tour of the house, and she kept talking about Frances Seward. She said Frances Seward has been unfairly overlooked by historians. She took me into the study, and she explained the work that she had done with William Seward when he was a local lawyer on the famous William Freeman case, which we can talk about later if there's any time. She took me into the basement, in the original basement kitchen, talked about Harriet Tubman and her connection to Frances Seward, and mentioned Martha Coffin Wright. So I left that day, having to finish my research for the previous book, but constantly thinking about this story. And so that really was the beginning of it. I realized there was this connection among these three women, and I just wanted to know more.
Thank you. And I think we'll jump to Michelle Galvin, another author on this panel tonight. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to give a special thank you to Courtney, though, for her invitation to be on the panel tonight. And I am pleased and happy to be here. In terms of the connections, what I think is so fascinating is that Ms. Wigington has been able to at least provide to me, and I'm sure the entire readership, a wonderful personal picture of Frances. I had always felt, based on the research that my mom and I have done, that there was a special relationship with Frances. However, I couldn't pin it down. I couldn't find anything that really spoke to it. We realized that she did take slaves in her lower basement, learned that fact from a tour that I took at the Seward home. and that she also possibly put them in the dormitory, which is in the back of the home. And so I kind of clung to that idea of slaves being hidden in Frances's basement and her dormitory, outside dormitory. But I could not find the real connections that I really wanted to know about. And I think that with this book, The Agitators, it just brings Frances and her relationship to Aunt Harriet in so much clearer focus that I really appreciate it. One, because I know as an author and researcher that it takes years to be able to connect these kinds of dots. And with our research on Aunt Harriet, so focused in on her and her family members, really did not leave enough time to answer some of these very important questions. And so I feel very, very informed and now enlightened as to Frances, more than just the wife of William H. Seward, but her own person, her own thoughts, her own feelings. And I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Michelle, before I jump, do you mind just sharing a little bit from your book and maybe what you've learned when you were doing your research?
Yes, yes, yes. Well, I think it was mentioned earlier that the book was published in 2013. But what wasn't said was that that my mom and I literally had worked on that book since 1999, um, taking research that she had done over a number of years. And let me just say, I am so proud of my mom. You know, she was not doing that work during the time of internet and accessibility to all of the records that we have access to today. I mean, you could literally see her in the public libraries going through the 3x5 cards and looking at the microfiche. And I am just so proud that I would say that so much of the work that she was able to uncover in those days really comports with the historical writings of folks today. So that's what really gave rise to the book. She wanted not only her children and her children's children to know what she found, but she also thought that others would find it interesting as well. And I could go on for hours about Anne Harriet, obviously, and I certainly will not do that tonight. But I will tell you that when you dig deeper and really try to connect the dots about not Anne Harriet, the icon, but Anne Harriet, the woman, the daughter, the wife, the aunt, you find that there are personal qualities that she carried that are not often talked about. For example, self sacrifice. Self sacrifice. When you talk about her willingness to die for the cause, that is something that's rarely found. It's found in some activists, but to really say in their own words that they would rather die than not have freedom. She had two choices in her mind, either to be free or she would be dead, and she was bound to have one of them. So, self sacrifice to me, as a personal quality, is something that stands out with Aunt Harriet. The other is compassion. Now, I know we think colloquially what compassion is all about, but there's really a second part of compassion that I really think speaks to Anne Harriet. It's not only um, feeling what someone else feels, feeling their struggle, feeling their pain, but also wanting to make sure that you yourself eradicate it or find a way to eliminate it. We don't often talk about Anne Harriet in terms of her compassion. And the other certainly would be service to others. Service to others, not only her family, but to her community, her feelings around safety and security for all Black people at that time was enormous. And enormous enough that she would put her life at stake in order to bring many of those folks to freedom. And then there's the element of trustworthiness. It's one thing to be, back in those days, a Black woman, but to be a Black woman who was doing the things that she was doing, um, trust had to be garnered. And she was able to do that not only for her brood, as she called them, that she would bring out of slavery, but she had to do that with the station masters. She had to do it with the numbers of people who were then very staunch abolitionists, all of the people working on the Underground Railroad, the folks that she engaged. When I say folks, I really do mean slaves at that time that she engaged during the Civil War to get the intelligence, about where the raids were to happen on the Combahee River. Where were the torpedoes placed? Where were the munitions? So these are the kinds of things that I think Dorothy's work speaks to, but I think in general, those are things that we need to know about Aunt Harriet, the icon. She was just an incredible woman.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a beautiful segue to another descendant of Harriet Tubman, Judith Bryant, who is also well studied on her great great aunt and can tell us a few things about the human side of Aunt Harriet and not that larger than life persona. So again, thank you, Ms. Bryant, for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate being here. Well, I want to go back to one of the points in the book that struck me is the fact that the Miller property was owned by Frances, not Henry. And it was Frances who sold the property to Harriet Tubman. I had never thought about it or heard that way. It's always Seward to whom from whom she purchased the property. So that's an interesting fact that is certainly overlooked and misstated, frankly. So yeah, I appreciate that. I don't have really anything to add beyond what Michelle has said about her personal characteristics. It's well documented, I would say. If you've seen the film, if you've seen, you get a real sense of who she was as a human being, as a woman, as a wife, a lover, a fully formed personality, not just an image, not just an icon. So thank you.
And not to be forgotten, what we have the first full-time female park ranger of the Harriet Tubman House in Auburn, New York. Ranger Kim, welcome.
Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome.
Thank you. I also wanted to add that with Frances selling the property to Harriet Tubman, she was in violation of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which means Frances should have been put in jail for 6 months and fined $1,000. And loose calculations, that's about $30,000 in today's funds. But by the time Harriet Tubman meets Frances Seward, gets to know her, her husband is now on the federal side, state senator, and will soon be Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln. So it looks like that formed a little umbrella of protection over Frances in doing this. And of course, Harriet Tubman could have been arrested and taken back down south as well. So all of the movement through Auburn, which was a true hub of the Underground Railroad, is moving people up to Canada. And for Harriet Tubman, that was crossing the suspension bridge over the Niagara River and heading over into St. Catharines, where she first sets up her first philanthropic organization to help those who are newly free to get settled in the community. So I'm just awestruck with all three of these women. And in talking about the connections that I can't wait to get Dorothy's book and read it, was I was when I first on the project trying to figure out how did Harriet Tubman end up in Auburn? And so what it is, Harriet Tubman making her way alone all the way to Philadelphia, then realizing how wonderful it is to be in that quasi state of freedom, that she misses her family. And so this is when she meets up with William Still, who many call the father of the Underground Railroad. And through William Still, then Harriet Tubman will meet Lucretia Mott. And because her sister is Martha Coffin Wright, then that connection comes to Auburn. And then Martha Coffin Wright's husband's law partner is William Seward. So it's almost like, as we talk about those degrees of separation, this is definitely those crumbs that were left that you can follow and see that the relationships of these people, especially these women, are what really drove so much of what Auburn was about during that time period.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I had shared earlier that the excerpt really has me excited about being able to get this book. But I want to share one of the things that I would have never thought about just because, and even though I live here, but just because it doesn't occur to me to, it didn't occur to me to think about it, but it was, as I was reading it, I picked up on maybe Frances being a bit impatient with her husband's like strategic political thinking. And there were times when she was like, we need to push a little harder, but he wanted to host all of these extravagant galas and maybe, you know, do some of that. I'm going to reach across the aisle and get other people on board. But she seemed to be, once she met Martha, like, no, let's do this. And what exactly are you not getting? Because you've been doing this work for like 30 plus years. Dorothy, so when you were doing your research, and there are other little, you know, incidences throughout this excerpt where I see that. Did you see that a lot?
See which a lot.
See a lot, her impatience with,
Yes.
okay.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, in Seward, in fairness to Seward, he was a politician. He was yes, he was anti-slavery. He was not an abolitionist per se. She was a radical abolitionist. So they believed in abolishing slavery immediately, but they were outside the system. And they were rebels. And so it's easier if you're outside the system to criticize those in the system. So one of the fascinating things about the correspondence, especially as the Civil War draws near and then into the Civil War, the correspondence between Frances and her husband is this argument that they keep having about emancipation. And in one of her letters, which is reproduced in the book, she says, you know, Henry, how can you say that, how can you rationalize, given that your entire career has been devoted to speaking out against slavery, that it is all right to keep 4 million people in bonds? How can you say that? And she was right too, but he and Lincoln had a very political way of approaching the war and emancipation, and they would only move when the time was right.
Thank you. Courtney, I think since you are the architect of this, I think I'll jump to you. Do you have a question, Steve?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really fascinating since we're talking about the husband-wife relationship. The other one that fascinates me, and if you could just talk a little bit about what really made Martha Coffin Wright this dangerous woman. But what I also find so fascinating is that while she and her husband were on the same page with being abolitionist, he was very opposed to women's rights. And you see that in some of the letters that she writes. And it's very funny, the things that she would write to her sister about her husband and his response to some of the things that she was doing for the women's rights movement.
Yes, it took him many years to kind of get on the bandwagon, of many years. And so letters for Martha were a way of letting off steam. And of course, Lucretia completely understood, you know, where she was coming from. And so she wrote one very funny letter of him relatively early on saying that, oh, David, her husband, he comes to me and there's a button lost on his shirt. And he says, oh, you know what, you know, it's the small things in life that make people happy. And, you know, she's furious. She says, I'm working all day to the bone, every single day, to help him and the children. And can he not be self-sufficient for 5 minutes? So these dynamics, it's the personal is political, these internal dynamics which also, and then of course when Frances and Martha get together, they talk about some of this, and they're furious about the bigger injustices, men beating up their wives, as they did routinely, by the way. To them it is absolutely outrageous. So it takes them a little while. They have this sense of injustice. It takes them a number of years to get up the courage, to come out and do something about it. And they do it. Each does it in her own way. Frances does it mostly through her husband. He doesn't want, even though he's ostensibly for women's rights, he doesn't want her to be outwardly lobbying for abolition because it might hurt him first and the Whig Party and then the Republican Party. He wants to maintain a more moderate position. So again, the personal is political, and you just sort of see that working its way out in private, and then you see how it bursts out, eventually into the public, and how these trends are beginning to kind of make their way out through these two movements, the women's movement and the abolition movement.
I would like to direct this question to both Judy and Michelle. What are some of the ways that you are preserving Harriet's legacy? And since we're in a time where there seems to be like a newfound interest, which is strange to me, about Harriet Tubman, she should have always been on the forefront of everyone's minds when we think about history. But now there's this big spotlight on her. So what are some of the ways that you're doing to help preserve that and also push that forward? And we'll go with you, Michelle, first. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. How do we preserve Aunt Harriet's legacy is how I hear you asking that question. And all I can say for me and my family is that we have gathered as much information as we possibly can on Aunt Harriet, given the fact that family history is living history. So what we wrote in the book about Aunt Harriet, there are several new bits of information that now have to be added to it. So I think one of the things we want to do is to make sure that we're faithful to her legacy, faithful to her history, and be able to do whatever we can. And when I say we, I basically am talking about myself, my mother, my sister Adrienne, my brother Mark, and we have cousins as well on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And I was once told by a very wise person that it's okay for every descendant in their own way, the way they choose to promote Aunt Harriet's legacy. But getting back to me and my immediate family, the book is really our way of making sure that others know what we know about Aunt Harriet. The difference between our book and other books is that it really is looking at her, Aunt Harriet, the person, as a person in the family. It's a slightly different kind of twist, but we do want people to know what we know about her. And the name of the book, as we've talked before, is Beyond the Underground, Aunt Harriet Moses of Her People. And I am on the public speaking, what would you call that, Courtney? Just out there. I probably have now, over the years, have done probably close to maybe 150 different public presentations, not only on Aunt Harriet, but also having book signings as well as part of that work. And I think that that's how we're choosing to promote her legacy. And then wherever we can add new information, we do that too. So that we're up to date.
Fantastic. Yes. Thank you. Judy.
Yes, well, I live at this house is an archive in itself, and I have countless scrapbooks, photographs, trunks in the attic, all sorts of physical china cabinets, furniture, all sorts of things that I'm working to catalog, which will eventually find a home beyond this one. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Awesome. Well, we can't wait till we get to see some of those things that you have archived and share it with this community, and then we can share it with the rest of
Well, it's a matter of photographing and digitizing. It's a lot of work.
I bet. We definitely look forward to that. I want to ask Jeff and Ranger Kim this question. Since you all have been in conversation with Dorothy, and clearly we've all learned things. Some of you have the book fully, and some of us only have the excerpt, but you've learned things. How in your tours are you going to incorporate some of the things that you have learned from this book? And we'll start with Ranger Kim.
An excellent question. Since Harriet Tubman National Historical Park is a newer park, it was created in January of 2017. One of the things that we begin working on almost immediately is really figuring out who was Harriet Tubman and what was her significance to the American people. And that has not, it sounds like that could be something easy to do. And it's like, Dorothy and Judith and Michelle talk about, doing all the research. Each time we delve into something, we find something else about Harriet Tubman. And again, that needs to be added in. One of the things that we've been doing is actually looking at what's happening in the country right before Harriet Tubman's birth and then through her entire life. Because so many times, she's treated as if she lives in a bubble, like a capsule, and the outside world does not have any effect on her, when in actuality, she's being pushed and shoved and learning how to manage her life and do what she wants to do, free her family in all these constraints. And then it stops. She's politicized in the 1850s. It's Dorothy brings up. I can't wait to get the book to delve into more of this. But she's politicized early by Lucretia Mott. So she starts working not only in abolitionist circles, but in suffrage circles. And that's going to continue the rest of her life. And then, of course, she starts her own, with the help of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, a nursing home for aged people in her community. So this is the Harriet Tubman Home for Aged and Infirm Negroes. This is for the time she's doing this at the beginning of the 20th century. She is also going to be taking in over 20 abandoned and orphaned children into her home and raises them over the course of her lifetime. So there's so many things that we're learning about who she was in those 50 years of freedom, and we have a long way to go. And certainly with Judith and Michelle and Dorothy's help, we're going to be able to expand that story.
Absolutely. Thank you. Jeff, how will you incorporate some of the things that you learned in the book?
It's a really good question. And I think one of the great things about Dorothy's book is that it compels us all, especially here at the Seward House, to do what women were trying to do in the middle 19th century, which is to shatter separate spheres. I think one of the tendencies I've had in my own thinking was to read Frances's progression as an anti-abolitionist, as someone who was becoming closer and closer to involving herself in women's rights, and sort of seeing that through the lens of her reading, maybe what's happening in national trends in history. Or I would look at Frances and Martha Coffin Wright's relationship as sort of a proxy to understanding just Frances and women's rights. Whereas her relationship to Harriet Tubman allowed me to think about her and her anti-slavery abolitionist politics, her involvement in the Underground Railroad. Even in the house right now, we've got sort of two separate exhibits. We've got a women's exhibit up called The Vote, which we opened last year for the centennial of suffrage, which is very Martha and Frances heavy. We've got, which opened in 2018, a new exhibit, Forged in Freedom, which is about the Seward and Tubman families and their connections. But this is forcing us to see it as something more broader, even at times diffuse, but really integral to the stories. You really can't separate them that far out. So I think one of the things that we'll be challenged to do is to continue to try to weave all these stories together through the interpretation, making sure these exhibits are bridged. Right now they are continuous, so you go from one to the other. So I think this really challenges us to keep seeking those connections and to not take the easier way out, which is to sort of look at them in vacuums because it's easier to understand them, but to realize it was much messier, more complicated than that. And it took a community. It took these women working together, being inspired by each other. That really is the true driving force for the decisions they made.
Thank you. I have a question for Dorothy. After you've written this book, and now that it's going to go into publication, what is it that you want people to take away from this book after they read it?
Yes, I think one of the, first of all, everything everyone has said, you know, it's very gratifying to see what people see in the book, which is what I was hoping readers would see. But one thing that I kept thinking about as I was working on the book is the importance of people who are seen as ordinary Americans and the possibilities for changing America for the better. And this is, of course, what this country was supposed to be about, even though it was founded by white, you know, privileged white men. Nevertheless, the story of these women and the possibility that they would remotely get anything anywhere close to what they were looking for just was almost inconceivable, but it did not stop them. And the other thing that has struck me is that, and we can see it here talking with Michelle and Judy, and then there are other descendants in Auburn of Martha Coffin Wright, whom I've been in contact with. And those families too have kept the legacy going. And so the Osbornes, you know, very socially active. The Osborne, they have a prison reform movement that begun, you know, many years ago. So they are following in a family tradition. And so I want, at a time where there's so much social and political division in this country, I hope people can look at these women and see what they were able to do with really nothing, no support at all.
Absolutely. So I think I'm going to open it up to the panel. I know it was supposed to be unstructured, but my mind is structured, so I kind of tended to fall that way. So let's just open it up.
Well, Rhoda, I have a question.
Oh, I guess we have a couple questions.
This question, because it fascinates so many of us. Now, I know historians are split on this story, pretty much 50-50, but the story of Margaret Stewart. So those who do believe that Margaret Stewart was Harriet Tubman's biological child, they're looking at the law, which states at that time that no matter what the mother's status was, so was the child she gives birth to. So if Harriet Tubman gave birth to a child, then that child would be enslaved. And so what I've read is that it's believed by some that Harriet Tubman gave her child to a free Black family, one that just had a child, so they could claim they had twins instead of a single birth. And by doing that, make sure that her child will be free and all of her children will be free from there, all the descendants. So my thought on all this is the ultimate sacrifice. And in so many other situations, women have had to make these horrible decisions, but for the betterment of the child. So I was wondering if anybody could put any new light on Margaret Stewart.
Well, I don't know that I can put any new light on it because I think there's several ways to look at it. Margaret, as we understand it, was a niece to Harriet Tubman. So I don't ascribe to the fact that she's a daughter of Harriet Tubman. That's long lost and, you know, all of that. And one of the reasons why is because in the research itself, when Aunt Harriet is attempting to get her pension, her husband's pension, Nelson Davis's pension, we find that in that deposition, she is being disposed about exactly that. Her relationship to her first husband, her relationship to her second husband, and whether or not she had children. And in that federal document or in that legal document, she's saying she had no children by either man. So we were always under the impression that what she was saying was obviously true. So the whole story about Aunt Harriet having a daughter somewhere that no one really knew about, but somehow appears, I don't think we pretty much subscribe to that. The other thing is that Margaret Stewart ended up marrying Henry Lucas and ended up having two daughters. I believe a son that passed away as well. But that Margaret and her two daughters, Alice, who became Brickler, and Della, that became Richardson, if what some people are saying is true, is that Margaret was born, in, I think it's 1852 or 1854. We always thought she was born more around 1850.
Mhm.
And it just doesn't seem to square with a lot of what's being said about Margaret today. She was a lovely person, as far as we knew, and Harriet considered her to be a niece, and that makes her two daughters related as nieces as well. So it depends on how you look at it and who's
Mhm.
doing the work. But
Can I
from
jump-
Margaret's perspective,
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here because I spent quite a bit of time on this very question. And I refer everyone to Kate Larson, who wrote, an incredibly thorough, distinguished biography of Harriet Tubman some years ago by now. So it was not completely up to date. So I have had I've met Kate, I've had lots of correspondence back and forth, and we continued to correspond over the course. And I kept coming back because I just couldn't, I couldn't figure out this relationship. And in the end, she convinced me that through recent research she has done, there was no family relationship at all between Harriet Tubman and Margaret Stewart. She believes that by going back to court records and various things that, and this is what Alice, Margaret's daughter, believed too, that Margaret was kidnapped, that Harriet Tubman, and this is just an amazing story if it's true, that Harriet Tubman loved this little girl. Margaret grew up in a free Black family close to where Harriet's parents lived, knew the family very well. And in one of her operations on the Eastern Shore, she went in and took Margaret away. She had a twin brother, took Margaret away. And this was after the mother had died. Brought her north. So this is the story that part of the family tells, and that Kate Larson seems to have confirmed. So some of that is in my notes. And
yes, I read that. Yes, I read that. I think it's in the back matter. I read that little paragraph back there that you had, that Kate had informed you about the family that lived next door. However, if we were to go by that particular piece, that would suggest that Margaret was not related. And it would also then mean that the Bricklers, who thought they were related, and they have descendants in Florida today, are not related. So I think we have to be just a little mindful that there may be more than one way to look at that information.
Yeah, and I think Kate would say too, it's a mystery that has not been solved. If you see a picture, there's a famous picture of Harriet and Margaret, and there's a family resemblance. So someone else has to keep going on that one.
Right. Got to keep connecting more dots.
Yep.
Anyone else?
Sure, I have a question. For us that live in Auburn, New York, we get to walk in the paths of these agitators every single day. And it's really fascinating to me that when we first started talking, that you talked about the significance of Fort Hill Cemetery, so much so that you bookend your text with Fort Hill Cemetery. So could you just talk a little bit about why you decided to do to bookend your agitators book with the image of Fort Hill?
Well, not to get back to my grandmother too many times, but her parents, she grew up at the base of Fort Hill Cemetery. The house is still there. And so she played in the cemetery a lot when she was a little girl. And I grew up with my grandmother's stories, and she talked a lot about Fort Hill Cemetery. So I had been there, and I was writing the book, and I needed a prologue, and I needed an epilogue. And I thought, well, it would be a great way to introduce these women whom I never knew, obviously, all these hundreds of years later, to take a walk in Fort Hill, which is, for those who have never been there, it's just a beautiful, huge, multi-acre park through hills, and it's heavily wooded. It's just stunning. And I had never been, I had seen my family's plot, but I had never seen any of theirs. So I had basically finished a draft of the book. And I got someone to give me a tour of the cemetery. And it really was just such an amazing experience because I felt I knew them so well at that point. And I wanted to see where they were buried. And I just thought that the proximity of the graves was also just an interesting way to talk about, it raised the question, how did these three women end up being buried almost side by side? And then to go back at the end, it just seemed like a nice way to bookend the book.
Yeah, I would share that, one of the things that I think about when I read an article, it was probably about 3 or 4 years ago. I worked at a local facility where in a ledger, there's a notation about Harriet taking a kid, and that kid being there for maybe 3 or 4 months before the child died of, I believe it's listed as typhoid, and please forgive me if I got that wrong. And I remember when I was shown it, I thought, wow. So she was doing this work with adolescents when nobody wanted to take those groups of kids, over 100 years before I walked into that facility to do the same work. And I thought, okay, there's a pathway here. Okay, I'm going to follow it. I'm going to do that. And like I said, I believe like that was my pathway to get to where I needed to be in terms of advocacy, in terms of research, that it definitely was a strong foundation there.
Mhm.
Any other thoughts that any of the panelists
I
have?
do.
Yes, dear.
Yes, I do. Everybody probably knows already. If you don't, I'm a chatterbox, so I'm trying to contain myself a bit. But there was one part of the book or the article, I can't remember where it is right now, that I would love to ask you about, Dorothy, and that has to do with the eerie similarity between the antics of the ruffians in 1820 and what we just experienced 100 years later at the Capitol.
Yeah, so you're referring to the article in the New Yorker,
Yes,
and
okay, the article.
which I was writing just after the assault on the Capitol. And there again, I mean, these resonances just keep happening. So for those who don't know, the Border Ruffians were Missourians who, during the settlement of Kansas, it was called Bleeding Kansas, because the Free State settlers who came from the Northeast went out there so that there would be enough voters to make Kansas a free state. At the same time, Missouri, which was a slave state, and a former senator from Missouri who was a rabid white supremacist, absolutely determined to make it a slave state, basically organized a small army to go across the border into the town of Lawrence, which is where many of the Free State settlers had built their town. They had built a whole town, and they basically moved in and torched the whole town. So it's just, when these, and this is where you realize history, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, here we go again. And I think this time, too, people underestimate Martha Coffin Wright herself, when she started reading in the newspapers about the Border Ruffians. She said, oh, they're not going to do anything. We'll just, no one should take them seriously. And people, right during the election, were saying, "Ugh, these threats on the these threats that these white supremacists are making, there are not enough of them. It's not going to happen." It already had happened at the state capitol in Michigan. Yes, but they meant it. So we just have to, pay attention.
And believe
Thank you.
me, will tell us 100%. The other thing really quickly, and like you, Michelle, I'm a chatterbox too, so I'll make sure this is my last thought. Maybe. In that, after the ruffians, there was a couple sentences where you talked about how the well-armed militia members crossed the border intent on voter suppression.
Yes, that's what I thought you were.
Yeah, and they
Oh
did it.
my
And again,
Yes.
that was exactly what they were up to. I forgot about that
Right.
part. This was the
Right.
territorial elections, and they came with pre-printed ballots, and they stuffed they shot legitimate voters, shot them, and then stuffed the ballots ballot boxes so that they could create a legislature that was pro-slavery, and that's what they did.
Yeah, and look what happened after the election and how our country was so divided about accepting the results of this election. So we have history of doing that, clearly. And this isn't the first time that our country's been so polarized or bold enough to do it, just bold enough. So we have a lineage of that type of behavior, and that I guess it's sad. And
And it's dangerous.
but
We just have to.
dangerous.
Yeah, we just have to keep. And this is why we need to remember the past, because this doesn't go away. I mean, these groups go underground for a while and then they rise up again.
Mhm.
100. All right, Courtney, I will turn this over to you.
Before anyone else has a question, I just wanted to ask about the relationship did you uncover any relationships? These were rebellious, bold women, and what was the relationship between mothers and daughters?
Well, that was one of the more interesting things I discovered about Martha, which is, as you can imagine, she was a powerhouse, and her youngest daughter, she wanted one of her children, at least one of her daughters, to become active in the women's rights movement. The older daughters were already married and had children. Her youngest daughter was Ellen. She desperately wanted her to become kind of the Susan B. Anthony of the next generation. Susan B. Anthony was one of Martha's great friends. So she actually she sent her to Rochester so Susan B. Anthony would train her to become a women's rights advocate. And Ellen didn't want anything to do with it. She had a completely different personality. She wanted to stay home. She wanted to get married, stay home, and have children. And Martha just simply could not understand this because it wasn't at all the way she was. So that too it was tough. It was tough, very tough for Ellen to have a mother like that. It was tough for Martha to come to terms with who her daughter wanted to be, and with the fact that her daughter was her own person. She was her mother's daughter, but she had a completely different life in mind for herself.
I see here in the box there is another question, and I'm sorry that I was attempting to turn it over to Courtney to end it. So I'm gonna give this to Jeff because I believe he has a question. Or a question or a comment, something you
Well,
might
either
ask.
way, someone in the chat here asked about the William Freeman trial, and there's a whole chapter in Dorothy's book about that. Maybe one of the high water marks for William and Frances's marriage in terms of being on the same grounds, about agreeing in terms of the politics of race and racial justice. A really sort of defining moment, I think, in solidifying the relationship between Martha Coffin Wright and Frances Seward. And speaking to Dorothy's statement about how powerful it can be when you come to Auburn and walk the cemetery to go to William Seward's grave and to see the words on there, the epitaph, "He was faithful," it comes back from the Freeman trial, which I believe was 1846, when a man named William Freeman accused of stealing a horse. We haven't talked about Auburn prison for good reason, but it's hard to disentangle that from Auburn history. He was severely beaten there. and upon his release, murdered a local white family, was nearly dispensed with mob justice. William Freeman and David Wright, Martha Coffin Wright husbands, took the case. They were standing up against Martin Van Buren's son for the prosecution. The town turned against William Seward and Frances, and they were sort of alone on an island, the Wrights. And we think about Auburn and why Auburn, history's hometown, and the sort of cradle for this sort of progressive grassroots politics. But there were strong countercurrents, and they were pariahs. They needed each other. This community was more essential than ever, I think. The community that Tubman would avail herself of a decade later. And if you're finding yourself at Seward's grave and wondering what those words mean, it's from that court case in which he knows he's likely going to lose, that his neighbors had turned on him for the most part. And he hopes, he actually says, that if some stray pilgrim like us 200 years later should chance upon his stone and remember the name William Seward for nothing more, they would remember that he was a man who'd been faithful to his principles. And a very moving closing argument in that court case, he extolled the jury to hold William Freeman up to be a man, to be blind to his race, to put their prejudices away and see him as made in the same image of the maker as anyone else. It's very stirring oratory, and Seward was capable of that. And I think Frances could see the best in him at times. And that's certainly in Dorothy's book. I think the challenge for Frances, for Martha, for Harriet Tubman, were that these sentiments were fleeting at times, that they couldn't rely upon men in their life to hold true to these, and the men were the ones empowered politically, economically, because Seward would equivocate. He would go back, be more pragmatic. He'd have the dinner parties. He'd strive for bipartisan. He would make compromises. And these were compromises that all three of these women in their own way found to be untenable. And they fought in their own ways, which Dorothy explores beautifully, not to compromise and not to have that happen. So when you go to see the stone and Frances is right next door, you should be moved, but also realize, as we all know here, and Dorothy's book explains very well, it's much more complicated than that. And look to the next stone, look to Frances's stone, and then go visit Harriet and Martha and see history in a whole new light.
So that's a nice segue for a question that we have from one of our audience members. The question is, what is the message this panel wants young women to take with them as a result of tonight's conversations? Dorothy, let's start with you, and especially, in writing your book, what do you hope young women will read that and take with them?
I want them to get out there and stand up for themselves, and to stand up for men, women, and children who don't have the rights that they should have. This is, one of the things that I'm constantly telling young women is women have a tendency to say, I'm sorry all the time. Some of these habits have been bred into women, for centuries. And Martha Coffin Wright had a terrible time in public speaking because she, even though her older sister was this genius at it, she just couldn't bring herself to do it. Even at the end of her life, she hated doing it. So I just think there's a tendency to pull back, get discouraged, especially at a terrible time like this, when young women, some of them don't even remember Barack Obama being president of the United States. They remember Donald Trump. And it's important to learn their history and follow people they admire and realize that it can be done. It can be done by anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, it's to make sure that young women understand that all the possibilities, that when you look at each one of these women and the things that unfortunately held them back, that they can, or tried to hold them back, that in today's world, looking at themselves, they can also overcome what's holding them back to be able to see their dreams come true. And they can, as Dorothy was saying, for others as well as themselves.
And I would just add to that I think that what better example of political awareness and political action than Harriet Tubman? And I think what she would want to relate to the young ladies today is, I think she would be saying to them today, don't talk to me about it. Do something about it. If you see injustice, do something about it. And I think that she would think that any young woman that would take that kind of command to get out of themselves, to get more familiar with doing for others. And when you see that injustice, do something about it. I think that that's what she would say to our young ones.
I'm inspired by, we have 2 new 4-star generals today, women. And I'm inspired by the women astronauts who have just been on recently, many of them, who are in their own way escaping the bonds of their limitations, perceived limitations.
Absolutely. And I just, listening to you, Judy, I'm remembered by a talk we had many years ago when we both thought that Hillary Clinton was going to be the next president of the United States. And we talked about, at the moment, Harriet Tubman was going to be on the $20 bill. And Judy said, and it's about damn time. And of course, I couldn't agree more. And then that whole movement, which was started by women, it had to be put on pause for 4 years, and now it's back on again.
It
So
will
it's
happen.
about damn time.
The president has ties to Auburn.
Yes.
Expand on that.
His first wife is from Auburn, Nelia Hunter.
And Hunter Dinarant in downtown Auburn
Yes,
is
is
named.
owned by her family.
So
He
again,
comes back
probably-
here. He has nieces and nephews here. He comes back here periodically for family events. So he has a vested interest in seeing that this $20 bill happens. And Representative Katko invited him here just the other day. So it will happen.
Good.
I'm just glad it did not happen under the previous president.
Well, there was no chance it would have.
Well, it's a good thing.
And one thing, I didn't really know any of these women featured in this book before living in Auburn. And so that's why I think it's so important for books like this to be written. And I hope everyone reads it and gets inspired by these 3 women and understand that they found themselves in a situation where they were the outliers and they were still doing what they felt was right in trying to give voice to the voiceless, and how important that is, and how important it was for these 3 women who lived extremely different lives, banded together and really became allies. And I think this book, I hope, inspires young women, how important that is in today's world, and that, we are still living and breathing a history. It's not that far removed, really. We're still making history. And so I thank you for writing this and giving these women the spotlight they definitely deserve.
Well, Courtney, thank you so much for organizing this. I really appreciate it. It's been great.
Absolutely. We're honored to have you for the very first book event before your Agitators is even released. So thank you. And thank you for everyone for joining us tonight. And this program was recorded, so we will definitely be playing this back in case you weren't able to join us this evening. And go pre-order the book. I already see some comments from several people in the chat that have already gone and ordered it. So we're very excited for that to come out March 30th. And thank you again, everyone. And stay tuned for all the wonderful programs happening this week for Harriet Tubman in Auburn.
Thanks so much. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
And all you out there, we can't see. Bye-bye.